And I think Adam and Eve go through that, and I think they are the members of the First Baptist Church of East of Eden.
No, I think you have it wrong. It would have been the New Hope Baptist.
New Hope, that's right.
Yes.
There is not a single person who is regenerate who does not have circumcision in heart. That is the covenant people of God.
And Ben, for those who are unfamiliar with circumcision, could you describe that for us?
It is.
Welcome to the Theology is Fun podcast with Dr. Corey and Dr. Ben.
Welcome back to Theology is Fun, everybody. Where theology is fun around here, Benjamin.
It is always fun, and it's good to be back right here with my man Corey, and we're going to talk theology, and we're going to have fun.
We're going to have some fun with ecclesiology today.
Yes, otherwise known as doctrine of the church.
Yes. Look at me with the big words and Ben with the normal words.
My role here is to explain his thought.
Yes. So we're a little role reversal today. We're so glad to have you with us. If you're on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and get all of our newest episode drops. But we are going to answer a really important question today, and that is very simply, do we need the church?
Yes. Yeah. And what is sad about this question is you would think the answer universally would be yes. But of course, there are people all over the world who are saying, I love Jesus, but I don't like the church. Or some people are even going worse than that, saying, I love this Jesus character, but I hate the church.
Yep.
And others are saying, church is a man-made invention, and we don't need it at all.
Right. People are pointing to dysfunctional churches.
Yeah.
Not that I've ever been a part of one or two or maybe three of those.
Where there's church, there is
dysfunction.
Yeah, that's right.
People point to pastors who get into trouble or who have financial impropriety. And people point to all kinds of things. So there's a very significant question being asked by many today, like, is the church necessary? Does the church make sense? We've read articles recently by people who don't even believe the church makes sense in our society. You don't need the church. If you have Jesus, he's all you need.
Right.
You don't need the burdens of a bunch of dysfunctional people gathering together to argue about the color of the carpet.
Right.
And pastors who are greedy and weird and maybe at times, they have failures and they bring disgrace upon the church. And so there is definitely, I think, a lot of conversation within at least a younger generation, younger than me and you.
Yeah.
About
there's a lot of gap.
That's a lot of young.
Yeah, that's right.
About, okay, is the church important? Is the church necessary? I'll tell you, I'll give you this experience, Benjamin.
Let me hear it.
I was overseas about, 7-8 years ago. And I was meeting with a missionary there, of all people. A full-time vocational missionary with a network of churches that some of you as our listeners and viewers would know, who said to me, his exact statement to me was, the church doesn't work here. That was his statement.
That is.
It had been in country, I think, 18 years at the time. And when we're just asking him to describe the ministry, hey, how could we come alongside of you and be a blessing? He said, well, the church doesn't work here. That was his exact statement. And he said, yeah, you got to huddle people in coffee shops, talk about Jesus and love Jesus in places, but the church doesn't work here. And I thought, wow.
That's crazy.
That's a big statement.
That is as crazy of a statement as I've heard.
Does the church work?
Does the church work?
That's what we want to know, Ben. Does the church work?
Does the church work?
In 2025.
Yes. So the answer to this question is not just in 2025. The answer to this question is, of course, the church works. So what we need to remind ourselves of this question is that the church is not a human invention. This is not man's invention. This isn't a couple of people got together and thought, you know what? I didn't make it as a mechanic. I can't change a tire. You know what I can do? I can organize people around this thing called the gospel, and then we can talk. We can have committee meetings, and because I don't have enough to do during the week.
Well, don't forget about business meetings.
Business meetings. We'll create bylaws that we can fight about.
And I just want to point out, all of your analogies there were car related. Is that because you can't change a tire?
Well, perhaps there's a little bit of inflection there. Yeah,
You couldn't think of anything but a mechanic analogy?
I wish I could change a tire. I wish I could fix a car. I can't.
But you can gather people around some religious zealot viewpoint and say, yeah. Right. So the point you're making, of course, is people to just wake up one day and want to have some religious weirdo club.
Right. That's exactly right.
It wasn't man's idea.
Right. This is all God's idea. So I think that we can see throughout all of Scripture that it is God's eternal and unchanging plan that He's going to have a people that He is in covenant relationship with. And on one hand, that is a bare bones definition of a church. Now, some people might disagree on the nuance or technicality of that definition, but I think if you're going to have just like a bare bones definition of a church, it is the covenant people of God.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, I think you're crazy, Benjamin, as usual. And I think it's safe to say that the overwhelming majority of our viewers and listeners agree with me on that.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, so baseline. Well, let me just say this. I agree with you that the church is given by God.
Yes.
The church is vitally important. I want to say to those of you, maybe you resonate with some of what you're reading or hearing or seeing, in that the church is imperfect.
Oh, absolutely.
Led by imperfect leaders.
Yes.
Filled with imperfect people.
Yes, without question.
Ben and I have been a part of churches where we've seen and been a part of all kinds of crazy stuff. So we certainly understand that the church, although I fully agree, is given to us by God. Mm-hmm. And I think you would say this, is in our day and time, it is, it's God's plan A for reaching the world. He's going to He's going to reach the world through the church. So there is, of course, a necessity to the church and importance to the church. Right. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Now, when does the church begin? How do we think of the church? And you're asking about, okay, can we say at a baseline that the church is the covenantal people of God? How did you say it?
I would say just as a base, right? When we talk about Romans 10 and other things, there are passages that are speaking about the assembled covenant people of God.
Okay.
And so when we talk about the gathering, the assembly, and again, there's room for disagreement on this. So this is not a divisive issue. I hope we're just agreeing to disagree on some slight nuance. But
who says we disagree yet? We haven't disagreed yet.
One, you said I can't be a mechanic.
No, I didn't say you can't be a mechanic. I said all of your analogies were mechanical in nature.
True that.
And then I called you crazy.
Yes.
But that's
okay. So
that extends to many things beyond theology, Ben. Okay. Yes. All right. So we're thinking about, is it legitimate to say that the church at a base level refers to all of the covenantal people of God throughout all of the ages?
And who are in faith. So what I mean by that is those of faith within covenant relationship of God.
Okay. Well, let's start then with defining the church. Ben and I would suggest that biblically, theologically, 100% the church is important. You need to be a part of a church.
Absolutely.
You need to be part of a good church, not a perfect church. There's no perfect church, but a good church. And when things are functioning properly, it's beautiful.
It's great.
Right? But we understand things have never functioned properly. Thus, we have letters in the New Testament addressing things that weren't happening properly 2,000 years ago. Okay, so then let's just think about the importance of this. You're asking me, do I think it's legitimate to say that the church can refer to those of faith in covenant relationship with God throughout all of the ages?
And when we say in faith, I would propose in the gospel. So my starting point is that the gospel is given originally in Genesis 3:15, right? The one who comes through the line of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, and that one gospel grows in clarity and detail over time and through the covenants. And so in my opinion, and not everyone shares this, and that's okay, is that anyone after Genesis 3:15 who's holding to saving faith in what will be the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is part of the church. Now, whether we want to make some distinctions and call something a new covenant church or that, I've got no problems with. But I think the baseline is those of faith in the gospel as part of God's covenant relationship.
Okay. So what I would say to that is we have to be careful in throwing around the term church too generally without clarification in this sense.
Okay.
So we're defining what is the church or who is the church. Okay, that's where we're going to start here theologically. So let me ask you this just for clarification purposes. Do you believe that Adam was the very first member of the church?
I would say yes. I would say Adam and Eve are believers in the gospel post Genesis 3:15.
Okay, so they were members of the First Baptist Church of Eden.
Well, they were cast out of Eden, so I would say.
Oh, so they were
east of
church.
Eden.
So they were church disciplined.
Yes.
All right.
Repented and then brought back in.
They got 1 Corinthians 5, baby, long before 1 Corinthians 5. All right, so they got church disciplined.
Yes.
Okay.
And the purpose of church discipline is repentance. And I think Adam and Eve go through that, and I think they are the members of the First Baptist Church of East of Eden.
No, I think you have it wrong. It would have been the New Hope Baptist.
New Hope, that's right.
Yes.
Because there was a split.
Yeah. When you get kicked out of First Baptist
that's right.
of Eden,
New Hope.
You start New Hope.
I love that.
Yeah. And then Cain would have started.
That would be a pseudo church. It would have been, let's see, the first satanic church of East Eden.
Whoa. Wow.
Yeah.
That things got serious here.
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
Well,
I
Cain
was
was
just
not a believer.
Okay. So the church goes all the way back to Adam. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this.
Yes,
let me ask you this.
Go. Yeah,
let me ask you this, because this is what our viewers and listeners are wondering, Benjamin. Yeah. Was New Hope Baptist Church East of Eden a church in the same respect as the Church of Corinth?
No. So here's where I would say that inside of these distinctive covenants are helpful markers. Now, here's the irony. Stephen, right, in Acts chapter 7, as he's looking back on redemptive history, and he's giving an overview, he talks about the assembled people of God, and he uses the word ecclesia.
Ooh, ecclesia.
And ecclesia is the word that you and I use for church. Now,
That's
the word
right.
just means
That's right.
the assembled covenant people of God. And by the way, that same word you see in the Gospels, not ecclesia, but you see the word synagogue. The synagogue, again, means the gathered people of God, the assembled people of God. And so that idea of assembled people of God goes all the way back. Now, are there nuances and some distinctions? Of course. But I think there's a lot of, probably more continuity that most of us grant.
Yep. So I'm comfortable with continuity.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with showing how God's covenant people have been in relationship with him, led by leaders, who are handling the word of God. They're meeting together. You have the presence of God, and then you have Pentecost and dwelling spirit and all this. So I'm comfortable with continuity. I just think we have to be very, very careful when we're throwing around the term church, again, without the clarity, because there are some who would say that the church began with Abraham and not Adam. There are some who would say that the covenant with Abraham to go to be set apart, that's when the church began. Some say Adam, as you espouse, and then some would say, no, it's strictly a New Testament dynamic.
Got it. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I would to that group who say it starts with Abraham, I would politely say this, that the first command to go was actually insinuated in the Garden of Eden, what I would say the covenant of works, when God says, go forth and multiply in dominion. So I think that's the first mandate, to go and to multiply. So I think what we see, and then we see that again in the Noahic covenant after the flood. He says, "Go forth and multiply," and then I think you see it then spelled out in a bit more clarity in the Abrahamic. So that would be just a gentle conversation, I would say, to those who would hold that perhaps it starts in the Abrahamic covenant. That I would say they're pulling the themes actually from the covenant that God makes with Adam, and definitely those same themes are going to be seen in the covenant of grace, which I would say starts at Genesis 3:15.
Yeah, those who would point to Abraham would elevate circumcision as a means of community clarity.
Yeah.
Those who were in the covenant community, where you did not have that prior to Abraham. I think that's one of the reasons they would argue for the covenant with Abraham as being the beginning of the church. Okay.
Got it.
Again, where I'm a little more cautious is I think Pentecost was a game changer.
Oh, certainly was a game changer, without question.
Okay, so let me get your take on this. So when Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew to when Jesus says to Peter, okay, and they're talking about Peter's apostolic role here, and Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church."
Yes.
Do you think that statement means something different than what was being built, so to speak, prior to that?
So I would again see continuity. So the statement comes on the heels of the revelation that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Messiah. So in other words, that statement says, who do you say that I am? He says, you are the Messiah, you are the Christ. In other words, it's the same Christ, the same Messiah that was promised clear back in Genesis 3:15 that has been brought forth. So I would say that if what we are saying is that Christ is building his church based upon that statement, that Christ is the Messiah, then that platform has been in the process of being built all the way back in Genesis, and is certainly now made manifest in the Gospels and very clear moving forward.
Okay, so would you see this Old Testament community known as the church, because you would be comfortable using that terminology, that the church is in the Old Testament, do you believe that church was for all under circumcision and all within Israel, or only those who were truly redeemed?
Great question. So this gets us into the discussion of visible and invisible church. So, and again, we don't want to get too into the weeds, but I think Wayne Grudem gives us some very helpful distinction markers on visible and invisible. So he says the invisible church is the church that God sees. So in other words, those are the people that God knows who are in saving faith in relationship with him. And then he says the church that you and I see today is the visible church. And so here's the distinction, that God knows exactly who are his, you and I do not. And so there are many people in the church, let's say the New Hope Baptist Church of East of Eden.
Yes.
I'm sure Adam was there, Eve was there, I think Cain was there, and Abel was there.
Yes.
3 of those, I think, are believers. 1 is not.
Okay.
All 4 would have been part of what we would see as the visible church.
So they made it through the membership class.
Yeah, perhaps a confirmation of sorts.
Okay.
But only 3 are a part of actual saving faith in the Messiah.
12 disciples, 1 was not
That's exactly right.
redeemed.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And so I think that we need to keep this distinction between visible and invisible in front of us, because not everyone that we see at a church is actually part of the church. Now, when we go back to the old covenants, there is like circumcision, like the sign of the Mosaic covenant was actually Sabbath. You can have the sign of the covenant upon you and not be an owner of the covenant. For example, Abraham, when he carries out circumcision upon himself, which, by the way, wouldn't have been a pleasant experience, but nonetheless, he carries it out, and then he carries it out on his first son, Ishmael. Ishmael now has the sign of circumcision, but he's not an owner of it by saving faith. So in the old covenants, you can have the sign of circumcision, but not be an owner. The same thing with the sign of Sabbath in the Mosaic covenant. You can participate in the Sabbath, but not be an owner. Now, I think the Pentecost heightened discontinuity that we would mark is that Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 31, says this: in the new covenant that's coming, in the covenant that is greater than all of these that we've been through, he says there's going to be a distinction, that everyone who is actually inside this covenant community will in fact be believers. And so here's where some might disagree. I would say the sign of the new covenant is actually regeneration, or the circumcision of the heart, which then many people display through believers' baptism. So here's how I make that distinction. There is not a single person who is regenerate who does not have circumcision of heart. That is the covenant people of God.
And Ben, for those who are unfamiliar with circumcision, could you describe that for us?
It is.
No, I'm kidding. Okay, Ben, continue on, please. We have to keep this episode PG, my
Yes,
friend.
we do.
Okay.
But sadly, there are many who have been baptized who don't have saving faith. And so I think the distinction between the new covenant, and one of the distinctions between the new covenant and the old covenants, is that in the new covenant, only those who have the legitimate sign, which is regeneration, interior regeneration of the heart, are actually owners of the covenant. So that's what I would say is the distinction in those covenant and the covenant signs.
Okay. So would you say base level again, there's a difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, or the church and the new covenant and the church and the old covenant?
Yeah, I have no problem saying that there is a lot of continuity. In the new covenant, there is what I would call heightened discontinuity.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And if we're going to use the term church to describe the covenant community of God,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I think we have to do it in a way that elevates the new covenant.
That's totally fine.
That's what I'm saying.
Totally fine.
So if we just start throwing church around,
Yeah, right.
from Genesis, 3 to modern day,
Yeah.
I think we de-emphasize what happened at Pentecost.
Okay.
I think we de-emphasize the confession that Christ is Messiah.
Okay.
You're saying, on this rock I will build my church, right? And I believe it is emphasized in a different way in the new covenant.
Yeah, I have.
So
at heightened discontinuity. Love
correct.
That. Love
so we
that.
just have to make sure that we don't. For those of you who maybe come from a more covenant perspective, because clearly Ben and I would honor throughout history how God has worked through covenants,
Without question.
for sure.
Without question.
But we have to speak of church in such a way that we're not giving the right emphasis to what transpired at Pentecost, what God is now doing through the indwelling Spirit, and what he's going to do ultimately to the end of the age,
Right.
which is different than what transpired prior. And that's where...
In a fulfillment sense.
Correct.
Yes.
So on the one hand, we want to say in this first episode on ecclesiology, the church is important.
Oh, it's essential.
It's essential.
It's essential. So in other words, the person
essential.
who says, I love Jesus, but I hate the church, you actually don't love Jesus.
Yeah.
Because in our next episode, we might get into some of the images of the church. And one of the images is not only it's my body,
Yes.
it's my bride.
Yes.
Right. So in other words,
It's like saying, I love my bride, but I hate my marriage.
right. Yeah. It doesn't work.
Yeah, to say you hate the church, right?
Yeah.
So we've got to press forward even through all the imperfections in the church,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And then we need to understand one of the reasons for that is that God has always given us a pattern of community, of covenant community.
Yes.
And I think that culminates at Pentecost with the indwelling Spirit, with what we now know as the ecclesia.
Yeah.
And the work in the world today through the church. And so we would say that the church, in the sense of this covenant community and how God's working, it's always been important.
Always been the primary means by which
Yes.
God carries out his purpose of redemption in our lives.
That's right. And today, when we speak of the church, I think the way it's most often referred to, right? This period in the new covenant.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is so profound.
Yes.
It's, I don't know if I'd say it's more important than ever, but I would say, man, how God's working in this dynamic through the indwelling Spirit and all the rest, the church, right?
Yeah.
With the structure and the polity of elders and deacons and
Right.
teachers and all that.
Right.
Man, it's what we see in Acts with the launching and the supporting of missions and missionaries
Absolutely.
and all the rest, right?
Absolutely.
Man, to not be a part of the church, say, I love Jesus, but I'm not a part of his bride, his body, not to be a part of this work and this movement.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Is to miss out on, in a sense, this is what we're saying, how God's always worked in the world.
Exactly.
But in a heightened sense, I
Yes.
think,
Love
how
it.
he's working today post-Pentecost, right?
I love that. So
Okay.
I have, not only do I like that, I love that.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
So in a word of pragmatism, let's reverse this. So to the person who says the church doesn't work here, I would say a lot of things.
Well, Ben, we have 90 seconds.
90 seconds. The first thing I would say is God has always worked through his covenant people.
Yep.
And he's always worked his one and only plan of redemption through his covenant people. And that means that he works through our imperfections. And our imperfections, somehow, some way, we don't look for excuse for imperfections, but they will ultimately bring him more glory. But it is the very hands and feet of the people who you look at, and I look at sometimes, and we see the flaws and the foils. It's God working through his church, through the bride of Christ, through the body of Christ, that he's going to bring about the future of redemptive history through Christ.
That's right.
That's it. So I would say this, I would flip it. So if someone's saying the church doesn't work here, I would flip it and say, if you think you can carry out the work of God outside of the church, that doesn't work.
That doesn't work. That's right. Because Jesus is coming to gather his redeemed, his covenant people, and establish the ultimate Hope Baptist Church.
In the ultimate assembled ecclesia.
There you go.
New earth.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in today. Next week, we're going to continue the conversation by talking about some important dynamics then of what the church is intended to look like, how we function within it, and really how we make a difference. So make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. Click that button and you will get all of our latest drops, and we will see you next week.
Adios. Goodbye.
Adios. That was unexpected. So was fables and foils. Like tinfoil? What? Foils? Really? What was foils?